Joining me is Hannah Weisfeld, director of Yachad, an organisation working to mobilise British Jews in support of a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Good afternoon to you, Hannah. How big are settlements in the West Bank a problem?
Well, I'm really glad that you've raised this issue, because you are absolutely correct that for the past nearly 11 months, all eyes, understandably, have been focused in the other direction. And whilst the war has been raging, there has been a massive uptick in violence in the West Bank, a huge uptick in settlement enterprise. And whilst I kind of agree with you that it does beg the question, does it make the two-state solution kind of no longer viable? I think there's a slightly different question, which is that if there is no other option in which Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace and security other than two states, what does the international community need to do to ensure that those violent and extremist settlers cannot destroy the possibility of there ever being peace? And I think that really is the thing that we should all be focusing our minds on now.
But when you have the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, basically saying, thank God we are building and developing the settlements and thwarting the danger of a Palestinian state. I mean, come on, we're kidding ourselves, aren't we?
Well, it does appear like that on face value, but I think there's a different way of looking at it, which is that though you're absolutely 100% right, that the extremists that are emboldening those extremists on the ground, Bezalel Smotrich, Ben Gvir, these people are in the government in very, very significant positions. The Minister of Finance, the equivalent of being Home Secretary, that's Ben Gvir, and they wield an enormous amount of power, and they really embolden these people who are out, really literally forcibly evicting people from their homes through violence. But the vast majority of Israelis don't support them and actually don't support the government. And so, there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis on the streets every day, every week, every Saturday evening, protesting against the government and protesting against Netanyahu, and they're deeply unpopular. And so it's not that the entirety of the Israeli public are behind those extremists. It is true that the extremists have captured the heart of government. And I think that's the quandary we're facing, because there could be another incarnation of a different government where you don't have Smotrich sitting at the heart of government giving power to these extremists. But as things currently stand, it is absolutely the case that you have a government that is supporting these people.
But it was only a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago now, back in July, that the International Court of Justice found that Israel should evacuate all its settlers from the West Bank and East Jerusalem and pay reparations to Palestinians for damages caused by occupation. It said that it was against international law. It was not entitled to sovereignty over any part of the occupied territories. And Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the Israeli Prime Minister, promptly responded by saying, and I quote, "The Jewish people are not occupiers in their own land, not in our eternal capital, Jerusalem, not in our ancestral heritage of Judea and Samaria," or otherwise known as the West Bank. That is what he said. No decision of the lies in The Hague will distort this historical truth. And similarly, the legality of Israeli settlements in all parts of our homeland cannot be disputed. I mean, look, you've got him on the one hand with, as you say, some very extremist ministers, and you've got Hamas on the other who want to see Israel destroyed. This whole two-state thing is a complete and utter fallacy, Hannah. Come on.
Well, I mean, what's the alternative? So my question to you would be, if we take your premise that the entire thing is a fallacy, you tell me what the alternative is.
I'll tell you what the alternative is.
I'll tell you. Between the river and the sea.
I'll tell you. What it is continued violence, complete and utter lack of security on all sides for everyone, and a hellish existence for the coming 50 years. That's what it is. Let's be honest about it, because if you've got 700,000 people living in the West Bank now who are changing realities on the ground by annexing this territory, and they believe that they have every right to do because it was taken in the 67 war and they regard it as occupied, well, fine, and they've got a right to do it. This ain't happening, Hannah.
Well, I would lay out a different path, because we can lay out a path which says that we're going to condemn millions of Palestinians and millions of Israelis to continue living how they're living, which quite honestly is hell on earth.
Yes.
Or we can say the international community can stop sitting around saying we've got the wrong leaders, we can't do business with Sinwar, we can't do business with Netanyahu, so we'll leave these people and we'll condemn them to misery. The international community could do something different, which is what they did. And the comparison is not perfect, and I'm not making a direct comparison. But in South Africa, de Klerk didn't wake up one morning and say, you know what, I think ending apartheid is a great idea and that's what I'm going to do. He woke up one day and said, the conditions are such that there is no other option here. There is no other option than to create a new reality in South Africa in which all people are equal. And actually, what we really need is an international community to turn around to the Israelis and the Palestinians and say, there is no other option other than to do the deal, which everybody knows could have been done 20 years, 30 years ago. And we're going to create a set of conditions where that's the only future that you can forge.
But Ehud Olmert said this. But Ehud Olmert, the former Prime Minister of Israel, has said exactly this, that there is no other game in town. Completely marginalised figure. No one's interested in anything he has to say. So why are we kidding ourselves?
Let me tell you something. There is polling in Israel today, very recent polling in the last, I think, 6-8 weeks, in which I think I'd have to check the exact figure. I think it's 64%, but it's definitely in the 60s. 64% of Israelis believe that the only way out is a regional peace agreement in which there is a Palestinian state. So Olmert might be a marginal figure, but there is a growing understanding in the region that actually the only way that Israelis will have security and the only way Palestinians will have security is to come to an accommodation. So either we wash our hands of the whole thing and say this place is run by extremists between the river and the sea, there's nothing we can do, or we say we're not prepared to wash our hands of this. And look, it doesn't just affect Israelis and Palestinians. You know, Blinken has got on a plane, I can't even remember how many times, I think a dozen times to the region in the last 10 months. You know, the entire international community is running around like headless chickens, basically, trying to literally stop a third world war. You know, the borders, you know, the river and the sea in that piece of land is not where this war ends if it continues. And so it's in our collective global self-interest to create a different reality, because if there isn't, we're all in danger.
But Hannah, what do you say to those people on the ground who say, well, actually, we've tried to coexist with the Palestinians, didn't work, they keep attacking us with rockets every day. The only way to do this, to secure Israeli interests and to keep Israelis safe, is to actually occupy their land in West Bank and potentially in Gaza too. That's the only way.
But that's literally what Israel has done for the last 50 plus years. So actually, there hasn't been, it's the opposite of what you just said.
But it's actually taking their land as well. It's not just occupying it with military force. It's actually...
Israel has been slowly taking Palestinian land since the settlement enterprise began after 67. So actually what's been happening for the last 50 plus years is that there has been no accommodation, and the lack of accommodation with the Palestinians and the lack of peace, or, you know, political agreement, I think is probably more accurate than peace, has created this terrible scenario in which we're in now. So actually, I would suggest that it's time to try something different, which is come to a political agreement. And look, the truth of it is that you can argue post-October the 7th, you know, it reinforces everybody's worldview from where they've started, right? So if your starting point is we can never make peace with these people, October the 7th proved that. If your starting point is my starting point, which is that without peace between Israelis and Palestinians, no Palestinian and no Israeli can ever be secure, October the 7th and every piece of horror that has ensued since has proved that exact point.
Hannah, how widespread is the view that you're taking amongst the British Jewish community here, and what are British Jews doing to put pressure on the Israeli government?
Well, it's very, very difficult to suggest in any minority faith community that there is a kind of consensus opinion.
Of course,
there is
absolutely,
huge divergence of opinion, and I can tell you now that if I sit here and say most people think like me, I'll have a whole slew of people, emailing me and calling me after saying I didn't think like you had. You misrepresent me.
Absolutely.
So it's a really broad spectrum of opinion. There are plenty of people who share my view, and there are people who share the view you laid out, just a few moments ago. So it's a very split, mixed picture. What I would say is that where I think there is broad agreement is on Netanyahu's complete incompetence and inability to run that country. And certainly, I would say broad agreement that the behaviour of the settlers and the settlement enterprise is really catastrophically failing Israel. And actually, to be honest, to stand on a hilltop and say you're representing Jewish interests, those people are not representing my interests or anyone else's.
Okay, Hannah, thank you very much indeed. That was Hannah Weisfeld, director of Yachad, an organisation working to mobilise British Jews in support of a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.